Okay, an important part of data ethics is this topic of privacy, and I want to talk about privacy in a digital age. So we'll use our familiar 6-question framework to really analyze this problem. Let's start out with a description of the problem. So first of all, I'm kind of limiting it here. I'm going to want to talk mostly about coercion. And this can be by any they that's out there, the government, business, big business especially, just society, malicious actors. Okay, the topic, I also need to talk about manipulation. We're going to do that more when we talk about the concept of persuasion, because persuasion and manipulation are very difficult to tell apart. It's much easier to tell coercion apart from persuasion because when you're being coerced, you're having to do something against your will, and so you at least know that it's happening. With manipulation, it's tricky. So I want to talk about surveillance capitalism. It's a super important topic, but I'm going to save that conversation about manipulation for a different time when we're talking about persuasion. Here, we're just thinking about coercion and how privacy can prevent coercion. The topic of privacy is surprisingly complicated. And I say surprisingly because it's a word that we can use successfully in the sentences. We talk about privacy this, privacy that, and we know what we mean or we think we do, and we hear somebody say it and we think we know what they mean without asking them questions. So we don't think it's complicated, but it actually is. And I want to convince you of that. And I also want to convince you that digital privacy makes it even way more complicated. So let's figure this out. Okay, so here's how I want to talk about this. Let's talk about the what, the when, the why of privacy. Okay, what it is, when we want it, and why we want it. So I'm going to talk about why we want it when I talk about ethical values, because the why we want privacy is essentially an ethical question. So let's talk briefly about the what and the when. Okay, so a definition of privacy, one that a common one that you'll hear a lot is privacy is the right to be left alone. So if you've been following along in this video series, you know that when it comes to rich, complicated concepts such as privacy, there's generally 3 types of definitions. There's definitions that are basically correct, but are either boring and or unhelpful. There's definitions that are basically correct, and they are helpful and are interesting and memorable. And there are definitions that are basically correct. Defining privacy as the right to be left alone is one of those that's technically correct, but it's not terribly helpful because it's sort of kicking the can down the road because now we need to ask more questions about what do you mean by that. I'm just going to say, and I'm not alone in this, but I think it's an important delimitation. I'm talking about informational privacy. The right to be left alone, the right to not have information about me known. That brings up questions about, well, what else could be included in privacy? Notably, a lot of privacy experts will, include decision-making in part of privacy, which is fine. I'm for that concept. It's just I feel like we have other frameworks, autonomy, freedom to talk about, like being left alone in decision-making. So I think it's better to narrow privacy to discussions of informational privacy. At least that's what I'm going to do in this video. So when do we want it? I'm also going to give you a kind of an answer to that question, but for right now, I'm just going to talk about some not so great answers to that question. Here's one way you might answer when we want privacy, when they are going after my enemies. I want it for myself, but not for my enemies. For me, not for thee. That's really tempting. And in the moment, that captures how we feel. Especially because privacy is like an enabler of crime. And so, when we have identified the bad guys, the ones that we think are bad, and maybe we're right about that, we don't want them to have privacy because they're doing something bad. We want the government to know about them. because they're doing something bad. Totally a reasonable, desire. But privacy is one of those things, kind of like freedom of speech. Um, you know, we especially need it when it's something that we don't see eye to eye with. It's an important check on government, even when they're investigating like what could be a real crime. It has to be there to limit the government's power. And same thing with free speech. It's like, well, I don't like your speech, so it shouldn't be free. It's like, well, I understand that. I don't like offensive speech either. But the point of free speech is that, it protects what people say, even when there's someone disagreeing with them, even when I find it disagreeable, even if I have more power. So we need to be really careful. It's totally understandable, but I think a not great answer to the when question to apply to myself, but not other people. Also, a bad answer, I think, is when do I want privacy? When I'm not doing anything wrong, I don't need any privacy, right? I only need privacy when I'm doing something wrong. And so, a lot of people think privacy isn't that important of a concept because if you're not doing anything wrong, why do you need privacy? Well, that's not a good answer to the when question. We need privacy a lot of times, even when we're not doing anything wrong. First of all, there's the obvious cases of like medical and lawyer professional interactions that have to be private so you can be forthcoming. But there's lots of other things too. There are certain, and I'll talk more about privacy for its own sake in just a moment. But there are things that you don't want to be that just are you want private just because, like financial information. It's like I'm not doing anything wrong, but it doesn't mean like I want all my financial details broadcast all over everywhere. Information, facts, images about your body, like that's not anything wrong. It's just like it's private for its own sake. Also, and this is not appreciated, but I think it's a really important thing to think about, is I think we have to have privacy in our intellectual journeys. We need like some space to become full people, and oftentimes growing up, working through issues involves thinking and maybe sometimes saying out loud pretty dumb things that we wish we hadn't have said or thought, looking back, or like, it makes us cringe. I guess I'll say it this way. They're cringe kind of thoughts. It's like, ooh, I said that, I thought that, ooh. But the thing is, it's part of your intellectual journey. So I really do believe that, the most interesting people have this process to go through where they kind of like go back and forth in their mind and they experiment with things, and they're just curiosity takes over and they're open, and then they develop their filter later, right? But if we go on our intellectual journey, knowing that we're under the gaze of others, like we have no privacy, people are watching us, our thoughts become very boring. We just conform. We don't want to like do anything wrong. We don't want to say anything that could be offensive or be taken wrongly, and so we just like we just are overly cautious, and we become dull. I guess I want to say. So I do think people, especially children, need some space to make their mistakes. And in a society with no privacy, I don't think they're going to get that. So even though they're not doing anything wrong, they might still need their privacy. Those are some examples. Those are not the only ones. There are other reasons, but I just suffice it to say, I don't think it's a good answer to the question. Also, not a good answer to the question is when it's convenient. And so, us human beings, we are a species of convenience. So, if it says click on this button, to give all your data away, but you get this, access to this little thing that's a really cool gadget, a lot of us just click on it and, say, well, I want the cool gadget. My data's out there. Oh, well, I'll worry about that later. That's also not a good answer to the question. So, we need some other kinds of protections that aren't captured here in these when ideas. So I'll come back to the when later, and also the why. Okay, so that's what's familiar with the problem. What's new about the problem because of the scale of digital technology? Well, the thing is, data is now, data used to have to be just like written down in a notebook or something like that, right? But we're no longer in that era. Data is stored automatically. It's created and stored automatically, and in that storage, it often can be permanent. It usually is permanent, okay? So whatever data you're creating lots of data by walking around, texting people, listening to things, looking things up on the internet. That's all creating data, your map location, all this stuff is creating tons and tons of data. That data is out there. It's just dumped into the cloud somewhere, and it's never going away. That is very different than how the world was like 10, 15 years ago, back until the beginning of human history, right? All that time, privacy was fundamentally different. It's changed now. So that's something we need to be paying attention to that I don't think we've caught up enough with. What's new about this problem because of the capabilities of digital technology? Well, the capabilities make so that lots of things that weren't really data before now are data. Okay, so it's not just tabular data. It's not just rows and columns of like numbers and names and stuff. It's things like your face print. Okay, that is data. Your face is a data point now. Your gait, like your steps. Your steps actually can identify you. Biometric information, genetic information. There's just lots and lots of things that count as data now that before digital technology couldn't be data, and now they are. And that has implications that we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, what ethical value is relevant here? So this is essentially, we're answering the why question. Why do we want privacy? Do we want privacy for its own sake? In the examples I gave before, I think the answer is sometimes. There are sometimes we want privacy for its own sake. Like the example I gave was like facts about your body or whatever. You just don't want it out there because you don't want it out there. That's it. There's no like because. So yes, that's real, but I actually don't think that there's very many examples. There's a few, but not very many. For one thing, privacy enables crime, and so we have to think about just giving people privacy and just calling it a day, I think is a little dangerous. So why do we usually want privacy? I would say that privacy is a value, but it's a second order value. That is to say, we want privacy not for its own sake usually, but for the sake of something else. And that something else is autonomy, okay? So the story goes like this. The more that they know about me, who's they? It could be the government, it could be business, it could just be society in general, it could be a malicious actor. The more that whoever that is knows about me, the easier it is to control me. And control and autonomy are opposites, right? Autonomy is I want to control myself. I want to do the things I want to do because I want to do them. Control is when someone external to you is saying like, no, you can't do those things. Well, the more information they have about you, the easier it is to control you. The easier it is to coerce you to do what they want you to do. So the more privacy protections we have, the bigger the barrier and the harder it is to control us. I think that's really the ethical value, the ethical reasoning behind privacy, even though it's possible in some limited circumstances to want it for its own sake. Okay, so what are potential solutions? So think about like what I said about how data is stored automatically and permanently. And also, there's all these sorts of things that we don't even think of as data, but they are data. Things, genetic information, our gait, our face, these things are data. So I just don't think, I'm all for individuals taking charge of their own privacy. That's cool. But I do not think we should expect that all individuals are going to be to cover all their bases. It's just way too complicated. So, if a person like wants to be, a privacy expert and to have all these VPNs and make sure they cover their face when they go outside. So cool, I support that. but I don't think that should be an obligation on every individual. Businesses also might respect privacy, and they might want to cultivate trust with their customers by saying, hey, we're keeping your information private. Cool, I like that. However, that's not something we can rely on, right? So businesses, we know, often give in to the profit temptation. So even if they say, oh, we want to do this and we want to do this, a lot of times they just end up doing the thing that's going to make them the most money. So we can't just say, hey, individuals, individual people, hey, businesses, solve the privacy problem. This is a situation where we have to rely on laws. It's ultimately laws, and the stronger laws, the better, the more specific, that are going to come in and say, okay, business, okay, government, this is something you can't do. Sorry, you can't have this information. You don't get to have it. It's illegal for you to have this information, to do something with this information. And that's ultimately, an answer to the when question, really specific legislation. So in U.S. laws, we have the constitutional law, and privacy is there, but it's not terribly well. Yeah, I'll just leave that. But there's judge-made law, there's state laws. The state laws and then the U.S. legislature-made laws, I think those are in the best position to specify the whens. They can, for example, HIPAA can go into some detail about like, hey, here's when you can't have this information. Here's another example of when you can't have this information. Does it get super complicated? Yes. But I do think those kinds of laws, strong, complicated, specific laws, are the best kinds of privacy protection that we can hope for. So that is a little bit about not just privacy, but why privacy is more complicated in a digital age.